Today on 3 Count Commentaries, we're going to add some context to this conversation that Dave Meltzer has started on Twitter. I think he was having a conversation with some supporters, but I'm just going to throw my 2 cents in there, even though I really don't need to. I just do kind of want to clear some things up because there's a little bit of historical information here. So Meltzer says, quote, "In 5 years, Vince grew his company from $10 million per year to $125 million. Tony grew his from $0 to $170 million. Granted that Vince did was more impressive, has growth adjusting for inflation, but he hardly started from scratch, had the biggest markets as a monopoly, inherited huge attendance, and had a roster of already made stars. Each did something nobody else was able to do given their times." And then he says, in 2018, revenue for AEW was $0 when he started it from scratch. Yes, then he spent money and signed stars. He says Vince walked into a company that his dad had for 30 years, and his dad got in because of his father as well. Then he says AEW grew and was hot, drawing big for a time, doing great on pay-per-view. The discourse was as bad or worse. The worst was the first Wembley, when people actually try to portray it as a failure. So, we're going to add a little bit of context, a little bit of historical context to this, because there is some discussions to be made. I want to clarify that when he says Tony Khan started with $0, what he meant was that Tony Khan had no revenue for AEW. So, it's not that Tony Khan personally didn't have money, it was that the company was not generating any money, which is an odd place to start, but okay. So let's start from Vince McMahon, all right, because there's a lot of historical context that is missing. In about 1976, Vince McMahon was actually bankrupt. He filed for bankruptcy in like 1976. In 1982, he pitched the idea to his father and his father's partners that he should purchase the company for $1 million. Now, a lot of people will say, it was a gift. You can't gift somebody a promotion when other people own it. There were other members who owned Capital Wrestling, aka the WWF, when Vince McMahon sought to buy it. Now, did he use the WWF to pay off his father and his father's partners? That is true. No different than when you buy a car, you use the car to help pay off the car. You live in a house while helping to pay off the house. That's just kind of how buying items work. It's not like going to the grocery store and buying an apple, all right? It's a completely different thing. Quite often, when you take over a product or you buy it, you're using it, and part of the money that it generates goes towards you buying it. But then we get into some interesting situations. In January of 1983, because Dave Meltzer mentioned that there were already made stars in WWF, which is true. The biggest star was Superfly Jimmy Snuka. And in January of 1983, Superfly Jimmy Snuka was arrested for domestic violence. He had beat up Nancy Argentino. And then he was investigated in May of 1983 because she died. Nobody has ever had to deal with that. Again, he didn't even own the company yet. And the biggest star in the promotion was being accused of murder. The biggest star in the company is being accused of murder. He doesn't really even own the company yet. So he eventually buys the company outright in June of 1983. He pays his final payments to his father. So now Vince has to start generating stuff for himself. In January of 1984, he brings in Hulk Hogan. And then the national expansion begins. He starts spending money to enter different markets. St. Louis, Detroit, Chicago, etc. He's actually going in and offering the networks money in order to take over time slots from local promoters. Now, of course, with this comes death threats, people showing up to his shows being aggressive, like Harley Race. There was the reported bounty on Hulk Hogan's leg by Vern Gagne, who wanted the Iron Sheik to break Hulk Hogan's leg. There was all sorts of stuff that was going on during the national expansion. Of course, Black Saturday would occur in April of 1984, where Vince McMahon bought the time slot from TBS, right from under Georgia Championship Wrestling. Of course, he had to give that up due to all sorts of contractual issues with Ted Turner that led to Vince having to cough up that time spot, and which ended up, of course, becoming WCW. And March of 1985, you had WrestleMania. Now, Vince spent pretty much all the money that he had to launch WrestleMania. Some of it, of course, he ended up getting from New Japan. Some of it came from the money that he got from Jim Crockett Promotions when they bought the time slot from him. So there was a tremendous financial investment into the first WrestleMania. In May of 1985 was WWF on network television for the first time with Saturday Night's Main Event, the partnership with NBC. This was something that was unprecedented in the history of the business. In 1986 was the big event, which was Hogan versus Paul Orndorff, which was over 60,000 people in Toronto. Absolutely huge event. I don't know if it's still on the network or not, but if it is, you should go and watch it. Of course, then the next year is 1987, which is WrestleMania 3, which is the largest wrestling event in the history of the business. And whether you want to debate how many people were in the building, it is undoubtedly the biggest wrestling event to have ever occurred. And then in 1987, you had Micro League Wrestling, which is one of the very first wrestling video games. The very first WWF wrestling video game was in 1987. And then in 1988, you had the main event, which was Hogan versus Andre live on NBC, which was the largest audience for a professional wrestling match in the history of the business. This is less than 5 years into Vince McMahon owning the company. So less than 5 years between Vince McMahon purchasing in June of 1983 to February of 1988. February 88, that's when Hogan and Andre happened. So again, not even 5 years, not even 5 full years. Vince McMahon had launched a national wrestling promotion, made huge stars out of local legends like Roddy Piper and Randy Savage and the Junkyard Dog and the Iron Sheik. He had more than one signature event that sold over 60,000 tickets. He made the company a household name. He created video games, and it was a marketing mammoth. And he was the runner of this company for less than 5 years. It doesn't matter what people think about Vince McMahon. What he was able to do in less than 5 years is tremendous. Now, some people don't even think about it in this way. But if you take just the first 5 years that he owned the company from 1983 to 1988, the hottest period in wrestling history was around that time. Now, let's take a look at Tony Khan for 5 years. So in December of 2018, AEW was announced. This is a company that Tony Khan is starting with his inheritance, which I think is like $100 million or something like that. That's not even really relevant. In May of 2019, they get their first TV deal with TNT. They had their first pay-per-view in, I believe it was May, which was Double or Nothing. That's the day that Jon Moxley debuted. Now, and something that we should give Tony Khan an incredible amount of credit for is that 2020, there was a worldwide pandemic, and they were not able to run shows, or they were not able to get money from the shows. So they were able to run the shows, but they were just getting paid from the television revenue. So there was a lot of money lost there. There's basically a year in the hole, around that time. So then the AEW in 2021 begins its hottest streak. CM Punk comes in, Bryan Danielson comes in, Adam Cole comes in. In September of 2021, they had their very first Grand Slam show, which was at the Arthur Ashe Stadium. Omega and Danielson gets 5 stars, over 20,000 people in New York. CM Punk's first TV match in 7 years. It's a huge event. Then September 2022 was Brawl Out, the all-out show where CM Punk got into a fight with the Young Bucks. That was the biggest event that occurred in 2022. 2023, they had All In Wembley, the biggest event in company history, one of the biggest events in wrestling history. This, of course, led to CM Punk being fired in September of 2023. In June of 2023, they had their very first video game, AEW Fight Forever, which, of course, did not do very well, but it's a landmark event. And they didn't really do much of anything. They had a couple of people come in, like Edge, and they had Mercedes Moné come in. But their next big landmark was October 2024, where they got the new TV deal, which extended into Max. So when you can compare the two, Tony Khan came into an industry that was well developed. Things like national promotions is a regular thing now. It's not something that's being built from the ground up. All of the marketing materials, things like video games and t-shirts and action figures, all that stuff. That's stuff that Vince started doing 40 years ago. Now, it's not Tony Khan's fault that he was born young. That Vince was born in 1946 or something like that, and Tony Khan was born in like 1982. I'm not sure about those dates, but Tony Khan is about 40 and Vince is almost 80, So it's not Tony Khan's fault that he started later. But you can't look, that's why you shouldn't be comparing these two things. Vince had to create new revenue streams. He did have stars, but then so did Tony Khan. Tony Khan came into the business with Kenny Omega, the Young Bucks, Chris Jericho, and a bunch of other people that pretty much signed on to be a part of this promotion even before they had one show. Now, Vince had to deal with people who already worked at the company. He was gifted somebody like Andre the Giant. That just came with the territory. But that's a positive and a negative. It's a positive because you could always use that asset to make more money. It's a negative because just because you're the new boss doesn't mean that the talent respects you or even cares about you at all. So it's a double-edged sword. I don't think that you should be comparing these two because of the 40-year difference in between what they had to do. But if you look at what Vince did, coming from a guy who filed bankruptcy before he even bought the company to just before the 90s, there should be no conversation about these two in relation to who grew the company better or who did more. It's not even a conversation to be had. All right. Tony Khan has not even done what Vince did in the first couple of months of running the WWF. Just the national expansion was something Tony Khan has never had to deal with. Tony Khan has never had to deal with death threats. He never had to deal with people wanting to injure his talent on purpose. He never had to deal with that kind of stuff. So while I understand what Meltzer is trying to say here, what he's trying to do is he's trying to talk about how great the growth of AEW is. That's excellent. But don't compare it to what the WWF did. Compare it to TNA or something. Compare it to WCW, I guess. Because what Vince was doing at the end of his 5 years was crushing network TV records and setting tremendous attendance records at pay-per-views, while at the end of 5 years, Tony Khan is basically dragging AEW along. They're about to start running smaller venues at the end of their 5 years. They're going to get paid a ton of money, but they're going to be running smaller venues because they can't draw. I don't think the comparison is fair to Tony. Even if you want to say, well, Tony started with money, Vince started with money. Well, Vince started with substantially less money than Tony did. Much less money. Vince has gone on record as saying his father wasn't even a millionaire, even though you could probably question that, considering the size of the promotion that he ran. The idea that Vince had a monopoly on some major cities, well, that part is true. That's also a negative because he was only known in that general area. He took the risk of being national. Tony Khan didn't really have to take the risk of going national. The risk for Tony wasn't much of a risk at all, was that launching a wrestling promotion in general is risky. But Tony Khan had an unending amount of money. He could do this sort of stuff. The financial risk that Vince took on an event like WrestleMania is nothing for Tony. You know, you could say the biggest financial risk Tony Khan took was continuing to run AEW with no revenue, meaning that they could not sell tickets during the 2020 pandemic. That was the largest risk Tony Khan took in this entire time. And when you look at the scale of the kinds of issues they had to deal with, Vince McMahon had to deal with his top star being investigated for murder. Tony Khan just had to fire his top star because he got into fist fights with other guys on the roster. These two are not the same thing. They're not nowhere near the same thing. You know, even when you look at the amount of talent they were able to convince to come over, Vince McMahon was able to get Roddy Piper, the Junkyard Dog, Ted DiBiase, Paul Orndorff, so many guys to come over. You know, Tony Khan was able to get CM Punk, Bryan Danielson, Jon Moxley, Chris Jericho. He was able to get Miro and Malachi Black, and you know, those guys to come in. It's the talent level even is different. And so it's not a good look for Dave Meltzer to compare Vince and Tony. It's just not a good look at all. It's actually kind of stupid. But I get what he was trying to say. He was trying to talk about revenue. But you have to talk about how that revenue was generated, bro. Vince created whole new revenue streams. He forced the issue. And he took the risk. Tony Khan was just following in his footsteps, which is not bad. You know, he's a success story. But let's get real here. I mean, these two things are not the same thing.
No one does it better.